Hello and welcome to Focus 54, your real and authentic guide to African news. My name is Jeffrey Murimbechi. We'll be giving you the in-depth analysis of what we are discussing today, and we're zoning in on the 79th United Nations General Assembly currently happening in New York, with global leaders bemoaning the crises and confronting the world today, including wars in Gaza, Lebanon, Sudan, and climate change, and an equal international financial system and the dangers of artificial intelligence, among others. And we'll be discussing these issues with our two experts, Mr. Gibson Nyikadzino, an economic and political analyst, as well as Dr. Leopold Chakanyuka, who will be joining us to give us and break down some of these very complex issues. But we start off with some news within the continent. We start off in Zimbabwe, which has called for the upholding of the UN Charter in finding lasting solutions to global challenges and spurring multilateralism. And in Mozambique, the Mozambican Justice Department has announced the Judicial Systems Commission, the JSC, for insights on the juvenile justice system, which has been successfully implemented in Zimbabwe to protect children's rights. As we touch down in Sudan, residents in Lear in the north of South Sudan are grappling with water threats that from unprecedented floods, as roads are severed and daily necessities are being cut off due to the disaster. And in Central Africa, in the DRC, malnutrition is contributing excessively to mpox exposure in eastern DRC, and more details on that story are available online. And the mpox virus is being dealt with at an African level. And lastly, we turn to Gaza, where protracted conflict has crippled agriculture sector in Gaza, and this has heightened hunger and malnutrition among the citizens. And we'll be looking at all of these stories. These are available on some of our news bulletins and also available on our news channel, that is ZBC News Online. Stay tuned for the second segment of Focus 54. Welcome back to the second segment of Focus 54, and as we zone in on the United Nations General Assembly, I won't be talking about this by myself, and as promised, I have my two guests in studio, Mr. Gibson Nyikadzino as well as Dr. Chakanyuka, who is in studio. Gentlemen, welcome back to Focus 54. It's been a while since we've sat down and had a discussion. The big issue about the United Nations General Assembly is themed along the lines of advancing peace, sustainable development, and human dignity. To what extent is this significant in global times, just looking at the global politics and where we are as a planet?
Thank you. So when you look at the theme, advancing peace, and then when you look at pockets in Africa, you look at pockets in the Middle East, pockets in Eastern Europe, Russia and Ukraine, and a lot more other things. It tells a lot about the design of the model that we are using at the United Nations, in reference to these issues of sustainable peace, development, and human dignity. Because the most people who are affected, especially they are those from the global south countries. And when people die, for instance, in South Sudan, when people die in Gaza, when people die in the DRC, when people die in other regions, which human dignity are we talking of? Vis-a-vis the idea that the big powers, they are also funding these wars. For instance, US President Joe Biden, he was calling for a ceasefire in Russia and Ukraine, but the Congress at the same time, it recommended a $375 million package for Ukraine to fund the war. So there is a disconnect between this theme and the realities that are going on the ground. So in as much as peace and sustainability and human dignity are spoken of, I think there is a certain group and a certain layer of the global group and citizens who feel they are enjoying these benefits of human dignity. But for others, especially in the global south, I think there is need to reshape the narrative. That's why for a long time you realize that Africa, since 2005, from the Ezulini consensus, they have been saying we want reforms at the United Nations because the interests of Africans, for instance, or the global south, they are not being represented adequately.
Is this why, and I'll throw this one to Doc, that in a speech read on behalf of President Emerson Mnangagwa by the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, Ambassador Frederick Shaw, that he bemoaned the death of unilateralism, and there's an emergence of the death of multilateralism, and there's an emergence of unilateralism. Do you concur with Gibson's sentiments?
Yeah, of course. I think this is quite important because it takes us back into the origins of United Nations to begin with. Why did they sit down and create United Nations? Because they had realized that unilateralism was the cause of the conflicts that we have had. When you read the opening statements of the Charter, it says, "We, the people of the United Nations," right, with the interest in saving the succeeding generations from the scourge of wars. They were referring to the First World War and the Second World War. So when you look at these wars, they were all caused as a result of unilateralism. So the whole idea now was to create a platform where world leaders can meet, interact, discuss, and find solutions. So the United Nations, in essence, was formed with a view of collectively work towards peace building and preventing conflicts in the world, because they had realized that if countries are allowed to do or to act outside of the provisions of international law, we would have the emergence of conflicts. So now the fact that the countries have started to act outside of the provisions of the United Nations Charter, you'd see that most of the conflicts we now have are emerging out of unilateralism. I would give you a very good example that is close home. You talk of Zimbabwe is facing, we have economic challenges as a result of economic sanctions that were imposed by the Western countries. And these were acts of unilateralism. There is no multilateral platform that imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe, but rather this was a unilateral act by the Western countries.
Is this any different from when apartheid South Africa had multilateral decisions to say, let's not have these guys attending these games and all? Is there a major difference between those kind of sanctions when a system was deemed diabolical by most of the globe versus this when country A impose sanctions on another?
Yes, of course. The whole issue was when you give reference to South Africa and Rhodesia then, which was, I think, the first country in the world to have sanctions imposed by the United Nations. The countries were acting collectively because they were acting in support of the United Nations Charter objectives and principles to fight against colonialism, because colonialism was regarded as a threat to international peace and security, and therefore there was need to collectively act. But the acts that are now being done by, that comes as a result of unilateralism, they are serving interest of individual countries. He made reference to a situation that is happening in Palestine and Israel. These are acts of unilateralism, right? And so you look at all the wars that are taking place. I was reading something that, a document that was telling me that, last year, I think, had the highest number of wars, spending more than 12 point something trillion dollars that were lost due to wars. So these are acts of unilateralism. So
I seem to be picking a pattern from there, which I would like Gibson to come through. It seems like historically, there seems to be massive global funding for things such as colonialism, slavery, and all of that. And these things perpetually seem to be shaping the international systems, like he's saying. What is the current situation? You mentioned the imbalance between the North and the South. He mentioned colonialism. How come these systems are not changing? Because to the viewer back home, growing up, we've always seen, United Nations General Assembly, covered by ZBC, covered by all international media houses, but there seems to be no change. Why do we historically and perpetually have the same problems?
So the basis of having problems or challenges recurring is because of the structural mechanism that we have in the establishment of these institutions. One, there are institutions there that are based on political power, institutions based on economic might, and also institutions based on ideological soft power and narratives. For instance, when you look at some of our post-colonial structures, they just transitioned from the colonial structures that we had, and nothing much has been changed. And even when you look at the ideological instances in the West, for instance, they have more influence than that of the global South. Here we are only considered as recipients of what has been manufactured in the North. So that's the biggest challenge that we are seeing, because there is no balance. While people speak of international peace, international calm, and other issues to do with security, the influences that are used to determine what we need in security, for instance, the recommendations and the remedies are not especially coming from the global South, because culturally, the North, they want to impose, especially from the West, they want to impose their ideologies, their missionary, to say what we are doing is wrong, you need to do this. So the reason now why we are having these challenges is because the South is also realizing that we also have alternatives. You know, there are other regions where power blocks are coming up, and people are saying now we have a choice. When you consider in the 1980s, in the 1990s, before countries considered to make a certain decision, they would ask, what will Washington say? What will the US say? But now, countries are saying, what will Russia say? What will China say? What will Iran say? What will Britain say? What will India say? Because there are a lot of alternatives. So we really need to look at the alternatives collectively to create a balance between the interests of states and also a mutual cooperation in terms of finding peaceful measures to sustain the peace and security that we want in the world. Because if we don't shift these narratives and the structural power blocks, it means these problems, they will continue for a long time.
Now, gentlemen, I have an interesting statistic that Africa has, by and far large, in terms of demography, the continent with the highest number of people that are below, in terms of percentage, that are below the age of 30, meaning that the youth population in Africa is the highest, as opposed to the northwest, like he was saying, what Gibson was saying, which probably has the highest aging population. Now, our president, President Emmerson Mnangagwa, had some interesting sentiments about Africa's youth population, and probably the world can learn a thing or two from Zimbabwe. Focus 54 takes a short break. We'll be back right after this. Welcome to the third and final segment of Focus 54. Now, we broke down the theme of this year's United Nations General Assembly, which was focusing on advanced peace, sustainable development, and human dignity. And our two experts in studio have broken down and made, in a very short space of time, a lot of sense and simplified some of these very complex structures. Now, President Emmerson Mnangagwa has also emphasized in a speech which was read by the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, Ambassador Frederick Shaw, that young people's participation in decision-making process actively contributes into shaping policies and changing the future of the continent. Now, I will speak of one young leader who seems to be a maverick. I will never stop talking about Ibrahim Traore and what he's done for the nation of Burkina Faso, with the radical policies that have reshaped the nation and immediately, within less than 5 years, changed the lives of people there. Looking at Zimbabwe in focus and the young people of Africa, how can we then reshape and turn back the tide of that historical colonial disadvantage, perpetual policies and the mindsets that seem to see Africa as as a begging bowl rather than a breadbasket of the rest of the world?
You know, I think that one speaks to also what he mentioned before, the reform first of the Security Council or the whole structure of the United Nations. Because the main issue that the African continent has been talking about is the historical injustices that have been, you know, done to the African continent. The first one is the lack of equitable geographical representation in the Security Council, because you are looking at Africa with 54 countries, right? And it's not fully represented when it comes to the Security Council. So the views of the African people, when in actual fact are the most affected when it comes to climate change, when it comes to peace and security, they are not really taken seriously. You know, I'm always reminded of the speech that was once made by the former president, Comrade Mugabe, when he was the chairperson of the African Union. He made a very passionate statement and plea that we can't continue to be going to the General Assembly. We make statements and nobody takes serious of the statements. It goes back to the structural mechanism of the United Nations, which allows only 5 countries to have what is called a veto power.
So let's break it down.
Yes. Yeah. So what it means like is when you go to the Security Council, the Security Council has the primary responsibility of maintaining international peace and security. And it's only made up of 15 countries. 5 of those countries are permanent members that hold a veto power, which means one country can say no to a decision that would have been supported by 14 countries. So it means it's a bit retrogressive, because you have the majority saying something and only one country comes and say, well, no, and then that's it. So the African country is saying, well, through the Ezulini Consensus, which replaced the 1997 Harare Declaration, they are saying, we want to be part and parcel of the international mechanism that deals with peace and security. We can't continue to be outsiders when major issues are being discussed. Africa must have at least 2 members in the Security Council with the veto power, so that we are able to protect the interest of the African people through using the veto power. Because you can't continue to rely on the 5 permanent members to discuss and deliberate on the issues that do affect. So that is one of the central issue, I think, which is quite historic, that has to be addressed for the United Nations to be relevant in the 21st century.
Now, Gibson, these 5 members, these 5 permanent members with veto power, we learned that at O-level history, you know. Have they been a stellar example of what they stand for? Because without having to name them, already we know one is conflicted over a conflict between 2 major countries, you know. One is actively involved in a conflict right now. Do they stand for what they say they do?
Yeah, that's the basis of the loud calls that are being made to say this system for nearly 80 years, since 1945, it has failed to speak to modern realities of what the world is going through. For instance, like what my friend was saying in relation to the statistics that we have. For instance, Africa is the 2nd biggest continent after Asia, but it has no representation in the United Nations Security Council. And adding to what you were saying, Africa, the median age of the African population is 19. That's the median age. When you go to Latin America, it's about 31. When you go to Europe, it's about 37. In North America, it's about 47. So we are the youngest continent. So in terms of the prevailing reality, it means that Africa, for the next 3, 4, 5 decades, it will be the most active population than the rest, but it has no representation. So when you look at the issue of the theme vis-a-vis the composition of the United Nations Security Council based on the P5, they haven't done much, especially by effect of veto power. And when something has been vetoed, for instance, Zimbabwe's sanctions that had been proposed by the United States in 2006, they were vetoed by China and Russia, but the US went ahead. It had done the same, you see. So I think they failed to live as an example of a nation or nations that thrive for peace and international security, because there is no mutual cooperation. We are looking at countries that speak from different civilizations. When you look at the United States, Britain and France, that's a Western civilization. When you look at Russia, it has a lot of components, the Eastern and the Western. Then China, it also has a huge civilization. So to cooperate from that basis, it is the biggest challenge. So in my view, I think, yes, it has been okay with the United Nations Security Council, because when you look at from 1945 up to now, we have not had any great power conflict where we have the big five powers.
Such as the world wars.
Yeah, you know.
But I know we can discuss issues such as, you know, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I believe by now issues to regards those are well documented and available online. We can also, talk about conflict resolutions within the continent. But let's localize this one as your last and parting shot. The last time Zimbabwe had a non-permanent seat in the Security Council was between 1983 and 1984, as well as between 1991 and 1992. Zimbabwe is throwing its hand up to say we would like our third kick at non-permanent membership in the Security Council, having been endorsed by the African Union and most African countries. What are your sentiments on that? Is it the right time for Zimbabwe to be involved? Do we have what it takes to be part of those 15?
I think, reality-wise, the Security Council is an elite club. That's the reality. And when you look at the functions of the Security Council, it is the only organ that has that prerequisite to make a determination of the presence of threat to peace and security. And the resolutions that are made by the Security Council are binding on every country. So if the Security Council imposes sanctions on a country, every country that is a member of the United Nations is bound by that particular resolution. If the Security Council decides to do a peace enforcement, that means it's binding again on. So by virtue of the functions of the Security Council, us being a member of the Security Council means we now have a bigger role to play in terms of maintenance of international peace and security. You know what? One of the person I think that will also be very interesting to interview is Ambassador Mbengegwi, former minister. Because at that time when Zimbabwe was a member of the Security Council in 1991, 1992, he was the permanent representative in New York. So I think it can actually give us a very interesting outlook of what we did. But remember, during that time as well, that is when also the Operation Desert Storm happened, and we were part of the Security Council. What it means then is, I think, and it's coming at a time when Zimbabwe is also trying to reposition itself with President Mnangagwa's robust foreign policy that we have taken since he came into power. So I think it will be an important opportunity for us to contribute in terms of international peace and security and the well-being of the world.
Gibson, do you think it would be opportune time for us, or it's the right time for us to be back in the game?
I think we have always been in the game as Zimbabwe, not only with the connection to the United Nations Security Council, but with some of the issues and initiatives that have been done. But what I just want to mention lastly is in terms of enunciating the SDGs at a local level, we really need to implement what works for us. Because at a time when we have to ensure that women are fully empowered, we stop gender-based violence against women, there are coming new initiatives that we are trying to catch up with, like, for instance, artificial intelligence and other things. It's an industrial revolution that's coming at a fourth time, which we have not captured the first, the second, and the third. So I think we really need to remodel our frameworks so that whatever we are doing to meet these sustainable development goals, it has to speak in relative unison to what we are experiencing here, because it doesn't make primary sense for us to just embrace everything. We really need to to model and speak to what we are doing. And thankfully, we are seeing that is happening. A lot of youths that are becoming entrepreneurial, they're becoming farmers, they are realizing the importance of land. So Zimbabwe being a major player, it's not only based on its presence in the the UN Security Council, but what we have done ideologically and empowering our people to ensure that they make life out of their land.
Gentlemen, thank you for planting all of these seeds, and you can see that we have not reached an ultimate consensus, but we have unified our thoughts and understanding of what's going on in Africa. And sadly, time is not within our favor, and we have lots to discuss, which is why you should always stay tuned to Focus 54. I'd like to thank my guests, Dr. Chakanyuka and Gibson Nyikadzino, for joining us and giving us their thoughts. Clearly, you could tell that each single time that they're speaking on each single topic, it is a discussion for another day. But unfortunately, this is what we have for you on this episode of Focus 54. My name is Jeffrey Murimbechi. You can catch repeats of this episode and many others on our social media, our YouTube page, that is ZBC News Online. Good night.